no, sorry. Where are we? It's a beautiful summer's day. It's the beginning of June. Summer is here. We are thinking cows. We're thinking pastures. We're thinking daisies and dandelions and the whole beautiful evening thing. I'm Charlie Turnbull. This is the Academy of Cheese, and Tuesday night is cheese night, as you all know, and it's time to talk cheese. Now, tonight we have a proper academic, somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. Not that I don't. I am a very serious intellectual, as I'm sure you're aware. We have Bronwen Percival. Now, Bronwen has a master's degree in this stuff. She also has been working for Neal's Yard, one of our senior cheese affineuring organizations in the UK, and knows a lot. So let's get her on and start talking raw milk, the very stuff of life, which she knows a lot about at the moment because she's just had a baby. Right, here we go. Come on, Bronwen. Bronwen, how are you?
Great. How are you?
I'm loving your background already. That's the proper dichotomy of the soul, the intellect and the drink there.
Well, we spent a long time figuring out which vantage point of our living room would be most suitable. So good if we were succeeding. Most importantly, I've got the cheese in front of me. So
you've got the cheese in front of you. Good. So you've chosen the cheeses tonight, and we're having a little bit of a sad swan song on one of them, which is bit tragic, really, which is the Innis Log, which we'll come on to in a second. And we've also got one of what we might call the grandfather of Swiss cheese, what I would call the Etivaz, but you have corrected my pronunciation. It's Etivat. Etivat, very nice. Etivat. So that's great. But let's talk about you. Let's talk about you. You've got a wee boy who's just 12 weeks old.
12 weeks old on Thursday, yes. So we're getting used to, well, I'm getting a whole new view on lactation. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, as father of two small ones, I still remember the journey. Let's put it that way. But also, you know, he's an expert in raw milk by definition.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's very interesting when you leave the hospital and they talk to you about the benefits of breastfeeding. There's no question about raw milk being infinitely superior to, you know, heat-treated pasteurized formula. And of course, I want to be really clear that not everyone can breastfeed, and there's no shame in that. But really, the information that they're finding out about the wonders of raw milk in that context, I think in many cases are also applicable when we start talking about the raw milk of ruminants and the cheeses that are made from them. So it's been a very interesting comparison.
Yeah, no, it must be fascinating because it's going to come down to the B word, isn't it? It's about the bacteria, the microbes, the little chappies who are living in the milk. Absolutely. I mean, there is a lot to be said probably about the milk itself, that, you know, where it comes from makes a difference. But we're really going to focus tonight on the stowaways. Let's put it that way.
And, you know, and whether you think of them as stowaways or the people or the people, bacteria people too. No, or the residents that you're really looking to do the farming of is a really interesting question. And I think more and more over, you know, even the past few years, we've shifted our vantage point from thinking of bacteria in milk as something that we want to avoid at all costs to make cheese safer, and towards something where we actually realize that in doing that and in making milk that's been depleted of its microbial residence, we're actually making milk that's stripped of its identity, and in many cases, which is less safe than milk in which the bacteria are farmed and encouraged, the right bacteria, I should say.
Let's take a step back. Let's take a step back, because I think we need to address what bacteria is. I mean, let's be honest, particularly in under COVID rules, having microbes knocking around isn't everyone's idea of fun right now. So let's just get it out there. What is bacteria?
Well, fortunately for the reputation of bacteria, COVID is a virus, so we can clear that one to begin.
Okay, good.
But within that, you know, these are microorganisms that are omnipresent in our environment, and I think, again, according to this old way of thinking, you would find bacteria wherever you look, but at the same time, they were seen as contaminants or something that was dirty rather than something that was, you know, healthy or required for health. So, I mean, there are multiple different families of bacteria and multiple, you know, which thrive in different places and which different places select for. So we can think about bacteria and the selection of bacteria that we find in any place really as a reflection of the conditions and what is able to grow there.
And I think I'm right in saying that the average human being is about 1 kilo of bacteria. Is that about right?
I would say probably that's close to it. And, you know, when you think about that in terms of the size of bacteria, that's trillions of them.
A lot of them.
And it's a lot,
Yeah.
it's a lot of
I mean, they're tiny. They're smaller than the average cell. I understand this. Of course, I read it on the internet, therefore it's not true, or is true. But you actually have more bacteria in your body than cells. It's just they're really, really small. So these guys they're co-residents.
Exactly. And, you know, particularly in the context of gut bacteria, for example, I think people are realizing more and more how many human health problems might be related to a imbalance in those bacteria. You know, we evolved together. And so it only makes sense that our bodies and our world has evolved to work in concert with these organisms rather than in a sterile environment. And because of germ theory, because of the absolutely correct thing that the wrong thing in the wrong place can definitely make you sick, we've spent several generations chasing these organisms to the point where we've eliminated many of them to our own detriment. And that has to do with health, but it also has to do with cheese.
I mean, let's address the bad stuff. Okay, so in this family of bacteria, which is vast, and there are many different types, there are a very small number that are trouble, right? And one might name, I mean, the one everyone's talking about, and you being recently pregnant would be big in theory, is the Listeria.
Definitely.
But it's some of the E. coli, a bit of salmonella, and TB. Those are the four that we are probably fair to say afraid of, isn't it?
Yeah, and you could say in certain circumstances, maybe coagulase positive Staph aureus. These are the ones that give you food poisoning.
I'm about to say that.
But yes, absolutely. Though it's actually surprising the small number of bacteria, of different species of bacteria, that we really do worry about in the context of cheese. I mean, when you think about the millions of different species and the thousands of different species that can be found in cheese, it really is, as you say, just a tiny handful that we need to worry about. But at the same time, it's important not to underplay the fact that they can be really serious, and we really need to make sure they don't.
Yes, and I think we need to stress that is that those chaps get out of control. We don't just see people having a couple of days in bed. They can kill people.
Yes.
Right. So we need to be totally on it. And that is the other side of the development coin that you've been talking about, is that on the one hand, we've moved away from understanding and wanting these things. But at the same time, we now have a really good bunch of tools about how to understand, count, characterize, and prevent bad things happening.
Absolutely. And again, thinking about it not as like we all need to use more bleach in our dairies, but actually we need to start thinking about how we can farm for microbes, how actually the control and the prevention of these microbes getting into milk doesn't start at the creamery door. It starts at the farm level. It starts as, what are these cows being bedded down on? What are they eating? How is the food for them preserved? How carefully is the silage made? All of these things are the ultimate source of safety in the cheese.
I mean, one of the things that one's also got to look at is that 100 years ago, or maybe that's not fair, 200 years ago, they didn't know what the hell bacteria were, right? They were invisible, not just invisible, but they weren't even aware. So for the vast majority of cheese making history, the use of bacteria, which has been essential and has been done without any knowledge of what they're working with.
It's one of the most amazing things about cheese that I can think of, is the fact that all of these amazing cheeses were developed without a knowledge of bacteria or the way they work, when they're actually so fundamental to the process.
So we're going to talk tonight, team. Well, before Bronwen and I get carried away in bacteria love, the way that bacteria have been part of the cheese journey, how they've been engendered, controlled, and to an extent tamed with the sort of starter cultures of today, and how that's impacted. But before we do that, let's eat some cheese. So who's first up, Bronwen?
Let's start with the Innis log.
Okay, so here we have him.
Close-up view.
Yeah, close-up view.
Yeah,
there we go. Now, I have to say, tell them about Geotrichum, Bronwen.
It's an amazing fungus. It sometimes it has yeast-like qualities, sometimes it has mold-like qualities. It can switch between the two of them, and there are many, many different strains. And of course, many people will inoculate the geo into their cheese, so they'll add the powdered geo into their milk when they are making the cheese. But it also is one of the fungi that occurs naturally in milk. So if you create the right environment and you, again, farm carefully, you can actually culture the GO from your milk on the outside of the cheese. And it's very, as we can see with this close-up view, it's very proteolytic and it's very lipolytic, which means it has lots and lots of enzymes that break down proteins and fats. So when it grows on the outside of the cheese, it sends down its little roots.
Bronwen, I think you need to slow down.
All right.
Just tossing words out like proteolytic. It's like that's not fair on most of us.
This is what I love. Anyway, you're right. You can see how it can send its little roots down into the paste of the cheese, and the enzymes within it break it down, and you get that lovely creamy breakdown, which I think is part of the beauty of this cheese, really.
It's interesting to say that, because I'm totally with you on this, because a lot of cheesemakers think of that as slip coat and begin to see it as a fault of the cheese. As you lose the integrity between the what you might think is the rind, I don't know if that's the right word here, and the cheese. And to me, when you get strong slip coat, that's where the flavors really bond.
Absolutely. And every correctness in my book is a matter of degree. You can definitely get problematic slip coat where your rinds are falling straight off your cheeses. And believe me, in our work at Neilshire Dairy, while we were learning how to ripen this cheese correctly, and Joe was working out the make and figuring out exactly how to get it balanced, we had some Innis logs with the rinds that fell straight off of them because we didn't dry them enough. So it's not too much slip coat is good, but when you get that real breakdown, it adds a whole nother level of flavor.
So tell us, so we're tasting a goat's milk cheese. This is a farm that's probably, I don't know, I've discovered it's near Ashby de la Zouche, which I remember from my Adrian Mole days.
Yes.
It's near Birmingham, basically. And they have a farm on the Thorpe estate, which is a fantastic looking, one of those big grey boxes with 5 levels of windows and arms out the side. And it's an amazing place. And they had a dairy farm there, and they turned it over to goats. Do you know what breed of goats did they use?
So it's actually a combination, and one of the things that they were working on really recently was actually breeding in golden Guernseys, which are interesting because they are a very rare breed of goats.
Sounds like Jason the Argonauts.
Yes.
So this cheese obviously echoes the Saint-Maur de Touraine, those logs, sort of 5 to 6 inches long, very fragile when they're made, when the cheese is only just holding itself together, and then you get the mold building outside and the drying out gives them the rigidity that allows them to sort of mature into it. But with this cheese, you are expecting the goat to live, aren't you? The flavor of the goat to live. So tell us about how the raw milk would change the flavor. What is the raw milk doing here that allows this to come on as it has?
Well, in many ways, I think that I remember selling Innis when I started working at Neilshire Dairy back in 2005. And to be honest, it was a cheese that we brought out and put on the counter and never sold. And then at the end of the day, we would pack them all back into the cold room and bring them out again the next day. And I think one of the things that characterized that cheese is it was still made with raw milk, but it used a lot of really strong starters and a lot of really strong ripening cultures. And instead of that beautiful GO rind, it had quite a thick penicillium rind, which was very white and very flat. And over time, I think what Joe and more recently his partner Amy have managed to do is really harness and make the most of the microbes in that raw milk to actually drive the cheese making process. So now, instead of using starter cultures purchased from a culture house, they're actually using the whey from the previous day's make to sour the next day's milk. So there's no added GO in this cheese. There's no added lactic acid bacteria. It's like a sourdough culture, but for cheese. And again, this is very similar to what they do in France.
So let's put some basic words on that story.
Yeah.
All lactic acid producing bacteria, which are the starter cultures of any cheese, began their lives in milk, right?
Yeah.
And hundreds of years ago, what they used to do is they used to take the milk from yesterday, allow it to sour overnight, exactly like a sourdough, and impregnate, I'm not quite sure that's the right word, but I'm going with it, the milk. Inoculate, thank you. The milk of the next day, and then you're carrying over your whey. And at the start of the load. Now, what happened when they started throwing chemists at this, or microbiologists, is they went in, got those bacteria, and started creating a little library of the bacteria so they can create purer starters. And it gave people more choice. But and correct me if I'm wrong here, Bronwen, but I think when you're looking at a natural whey starter, you're looking at maybe 40 to 50 different types of bacteria on out of a packet waste starter, as in something looks like a bit like a sachet that you've got from a bacteria house, you're looking at 3 to 6 strains of bacteria. Is that about right?
I think that's more or less correct. What I would say is that not all cheeses developed to use whey starters originally. And in fact, if you look at the British cheeses, whey starters were a disaster for them. In the late 19th century, when people were trying to make cheddar more consistent, they looked at the use of whey to try to do that. And in fact, they found that it introduced tons of defects and bad flavors into the milk because the whey wasn't soured.
So where are they getting their starters from?
They weren't using starter. And so you think about when you hear about the way in which British cheese was made, they always talk about you milk the cows in the evening, the milk sits in the dairy overnight, and then you add the warm morning milk on top of that. What they don't dwell on enough, I think, is the fact that that milk was not refrigerated, and it was probably sitting there at close to 20 degrees in the dairy. And that pre-ripening step allowed the bacteria that were naturally present in the milk to begin to grow. And then so when the warm milk from the next morning was added, that was racing away and ready to be made into cheese. And again, you know, as far as they were concerned at that point, there was no such thing as bacteria, and that was just the way the cheese worked. And, you know, there's some very interesting old accounts of people making British cheese in the late 18th century where they encountered this common problem that I think everyone in the cheese world knows all too well of blown cheese, and which they called heaving. Which is where
when you have pockets of gas developing inside the cheese.
Yes.
Am I going to say coliforms or chloroforms or that kind of thing?
Clostridia, yeah.
Clostridia, and they make little pockets of gas in exactly the same way as beer and bread and that kind of thing, except you just don't want it.
And that often develops over the course of ripening. So you can make a cheese, it looks fine, and then 2 months down the road, it expands like a balloon. And the way they explained it then was that the cheesemaker had made the cheese too quickly and they hadn't got all the air out of the milk. And that makes absolutely no sense now with our modern understanding of what Clostridia are and where they come from. But the really interesting thing was that they had,
got one of your hairs. I don't know how technology has managed that.
Through the, anyway, what they realized was that they had put, the solution to this problem, they said, was to make the cheese more slowly so that the air could get out of the milk. But when you look at that now with what we understand now, these Clostridia bacteria are really sensitive to acid. And so if you make the cheese more slowly, the acid develops, and then that inhibits the growth of the Clostridium later on. So they had the right solution, but for completely the wrong reason.
You know why? But I mean, you know, if you look at the history of cheese making anything, it's a series of trials and errors. You know, or accidents and trials and errors, and that's what they did.
Yeah, and I think if we went back 300 years, we would find that there was a huge amount of faulty cheese on the market, but there was also probably a lot of really excellent cheese on the market. And you can see in that context why the role of the cheese factor, the person who went from farm to farm and tasted the cheese and decided what to buy, was really critical.
Yeah. Right, I've got a couple of questions here. One, firstly, Avril is bringing attention to the fact you've written a fantastic book called Reinventing the Wheel, and it has a fuller name, which I've written down because it's about 12 words long. Milk, Microbes, and the Fight for Real Cheese. So if anybody out there wants to learn more about what Bronwen knows, it's on Amazon, I believe, isn't it?
Yes.
So
amongst
bring that on.
No, thank you very much, Avril. I have a copy right here for product placement if anyone is interested. So
even sign it for you. Right. And the big question, which we always need to know, do you have a favorite pairing for a cheese like this?
Ooh, I mean, we often serve cheese at the beginning of the meal, and goat's cheese in particular is a perfect thing to have to sort of whet your appetite. And just because of the structure of meals, we often find that we eat this cheese with champagne if we're enjoying a lunch with friends. And I couldn't think of anything better than a glass of champagne with it.
Yeah, no, I have to say, for me, I would be drifting into an apple juicy kind of combination with this. That's where I go, but that's unlike me not to have something alcoholic in front of me. Right. Right. Let's talk about the flavor here. Now, I tasted this before because I knew we were tasting raw milk cheeses. I felt to myself I had to be more attentive. You know, I had to find out what's underneath. And this is quite an interesting one because there's quite a lot of acidity, but in almost like an electric way. It reminded me when I was a kid, I used to put my tongue on the top of a battery. Does that make sense? And I think that you in your write-up, you've got hazelnut in there. I think it is, but that's kind of deep. I was getting grass, earth, and a sourness, and obviously the goat's milk. And also I was getting kind of warmth, straw, and obviously a bit of mushroom. And that's sort of my combination. But it's a weird sort of cold, warm thing. It's delicious.
Yeah, no, I think it has a great balance. And, one of the things I love about this cheese is when we get together with Joe on a Friday morning and taste through the cheeses that have come down, there really are differences from batch to batch. So even though it's using this continuous starter, all the same bacteria, depending on the way the acidity is developed or the conditions in the ripening room, you can get these day-to-day variations that are all variations of flavor, but not necessarily variations in level of quality. With this cheese, I get and many of the Ennis cheeses, I get a sort of pomegranate pith sort of aroma. That white stuff that's in between the little
I do.
pomegranate. And again, it's something I enjoy in this context much more than the thought of that.
It's funny because we're about to move on to the Etiva, which has that classic slight baby sick thing in there too. And you're going, how do I like this? Because that's not something you'd reach out. So let's talk about the Etiva.
Yep.
I mean, okay, let's show it. And do you want to introduce it? Do you want me to talk about it?
Absolutely. So this, as you say, is the sort of grandfather of Swiss cheeses. It's very interesting because in many ways it's one of the most tightly written specifications for any of the classic cheeses of Europe. It can only be made at Alpage in the summertime. It has to be made in a copper cauldron with wooden, with a wood fire underneath to heat it up. And it also has to be made using whey starters. So, again, not the same sort of whey starter as the Ennis. It's a similar principle, but because you're taking that whey off sweet during the make, you then incubate it overnight until it's very, very sour and add that in the next morning when you're ready to go.
Now, whey starters have that rather rude name, backslopping, don't they? Which is like
terrible.
Yeah, that doesn't. The Urban Dictionary doesn't like that one. I'm just going to unpack that. So Alpage in this context means it's basically got to be a summer cheese. And this one actually is quite specific. It's May 10th to October 10th, isn't it?
Exactly.
Because the cows have to be up the hill. And this occasion, depending for different cheeses, that's 1,000 meters or above. Now,
so
I don't know if
this one is made at 1,475 meters, although I'm sure the cows go up. That's the level of the chalet, and then the cows can go up and down and graze from there. They make about 14 tons of cheese a year, which sounds like a lot, but actually in the great scheme of things, it's absolutely tiny.
I have a brother-in-law who is obsessed by Munro bagging. Does that mean anything to you? That's climbing mountains over 3,000 feet. And so basically, every single this cheese is made at the top of a Munro, to put it in context. So
we went to visit Etiva production, and it was a real hike to get up there. You realize that these aren't little hills we're talking about.
And your that copper, again, these are this trial and error business. We're lining these cauldrons with copper because they have a sterilizing effect, which they would have possibly not known except by accident.
And also probably conductivity as well. It's a very, very good conductor.
Smooth all the way around. And they're making these in their closed chalets. So the smoke is going up into the rafters, and that impacts on the flavor of the cheese. Yes. So all these incidents, all the little characteristics of the cheese making are contributing to what it is. And if you pull one of them away, it stops being the cheese you're looking for.
Absolutely. And, I think the requirement to use whey starters is a really important, coming back to the raw milk aspect of that, the requirement to use whey starters is a really fundamental part of the character of this cheese, that, those are the bacteria that are going to grow in the milk and create the flavors as the cheeses are maturing. So the bacteria there, they die and burst open as the cheese matures because it's a very inhospitable environment for them. And then they release those enzymes that go to work on the fats and proteins and create that really intense, interesting flavor.
I'm just going to ask, is that the kind of thing you say over the counter in Neil's yard? Oh, these have got great bacteria deaths. What we need is big death bacteria, lots of exploding enzymes into the cheese. Give him 12 months, and the proteolysis just goes bonanza.
I mean, you gotta pick your customer, but those are the customers I like the best.
It is extraordinary to think that is the process of getting the enzymes that you need to deliver the flavor, is to kill the bacteria and allow those enzymes out. It's a fascinating concept, and you can see why, you know, Cathedral City doesn't want to talk about that. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, well, I mean, when those flavors come from sachets, it's very, you could argue that the milk being raw or pasteurized doesn't matter as much as it should. You know, I think this is one of the key things about raw milk that I kind of think is important to talk about, is that raw milk has really become a quality mark on people's counters. You know, customers will come in and say, oh, I want a raw milk cheese, or this one's better because it's made with raw milk. And I think if we're looking at cheeses that are made from raw milk that has no interesting microbes within it, or we're looking at cheeses that may have interesting microbes within them, but then are inoculated with really high doses of starter cultures with really dominant flavors and ripening cultures with really dominant flavors, the quality of the milk, the rawness of the milk doesn't really matter. It could be raw in name only.
Raw in name only.
That's
rhino again, isn't it? Yeah, no. But I mean, you've also got raw. I mean, a few weeks ago we had Jamie Montgomery on the Tuesday Night on a Saturday talking at the panel, and he was saying that he thinks that raw milk has its biggest impact in the young cheeses when there is so less going on. And as soon as you introduce washed rinds or external molds or flavorings or whatever, the raw milk begins to be covered up, less relevant. I don't know where you want to go with that, but it's not as important. It's not as important.
I agree with him insofar as I think that with things, the very interesting thing about washed rind cheeses is that a lot of those washed rind bacteria are what we call thermoduric. They survive pasteurization. So you could actually be, if you're just washing the rind with water, but it's a pasteurized cheese. And I think Gabine is a perfect example of this, the Irish washed rind cheese.
We've got Gabine on. Is it next week? Avril, is it next week or the week after? Very exciting.
Perfect. So you're lined right up. But, you know, you could wash the cheese just with water. It's a pasteurized cheese, but then those bacteria will survive in the milk and they'll grow on the outside of the cheese, and that can be a taste of terroir as well. So at the same time, I think one of the things that you do get in those raw milk cheeses as they age is that you'll have, you know, you could wipe out some interesting bacteria as you're making the cheese, and then as in the pasteurized version, they're not going to have a chance to grow to high numbers, and then they won't release their enzymes and create the flavors. If they do survive pasteurized, you know, if they're not pasteurized, then you can then experience those within, you know, more and more as the cheese matures. So, you know, I'll talk to Jamie about that one next time I see him.
So I've got another question which I have to ask, pushing back against raw milk is king. Sure. And we mentioned this before as well, that the World Cheese Awards, which is a credible awards organization, one of my favorites, it's been won by pasteurized cheeses, something like 8 out of the last 9 years. Mm-hmm. One of which is a favorite of yours, which is last year's winner, which is the David Gremmels's
Rogue River Blue.
Thank you very much, Rogue River Blue. And he makes a pasteurized and an unpasteurized version. And the one that won this year, or last year, was a pasteurized version. So how do you sort of respond to that?
I think that we have cheeses that can taste of milk and raw materials, and then there are cheeses that taste of process. And in many cases, the cheeses that taste of process have big, bold flavors that people respond to very, very quickly and directly when they taste them. And, you know, they talk about wines being made for competitions a lot of the time. You know, you see these wines that are designed to win competitions because they're big, they're juicy, they're, you know, they've got a really, you know, they're the sort of wines that are designed to stand out of a crowd. But actually, when you sit down with them, you might end up tired of them a little bit more quickly. They're designed to taste, not to drink. And I think one of the things that I love about well-made, interesting raw milk cheese is that it has layers within it that you can sort of live with and discover over time. It's not to say that all raw milk cheese has those, but I think the very best ones. But I wouldn't say that those are the natural competition winners either.
I mean, the other question that's bound to come up on raw milk is, of course, Joe Schneider Stilton, which is not allowed to be called Stilton because it's raw milk. And the story behind that, so we understand, is that in 1989 or something, somebody got ill at a party. I believe it was a local MP. Is that right? Or something?
it was an outbreak of many people getting ill, and there's a very interesting scientific paper that was written looking at this outbreak that was associated with Stilton cheese, which I can send you, or you can post on this
I'd
thing
love to
if
see
you'd like.
I shall read it.
Very interesting. But the most interesting thing about that is that they never actually found whatever causative organism was responsible for this in any Stilton. So it wasn't that anything was ever
proven.
proven.
No.
But I think people were shaken enough on the production side that they decided it wasn't worth the risk. And I think there's this real perception that Stilton is inherently a dangerous cheese, that it has a long, slow acidification, and it has a low, it has a low final acidity, a high pH at the end, and that can allow pathogens, if they're there, to grow to high numbers. Now, you could say exactly the same thing of the Innis log. It has a really, really long, slow acidification, and if you look underneath that rind, it's quite low acidity. And I think one of the big things that we have to remember about Stilton is that farmhouse Stilton really disappeared in the 1930s. And once you start combining milk from many, many different, sources and are mixing that together to make cheese on a large scale, making that style of cheese becomes really, really challenging.
Yeah. I mean, this is something Carol Hopkins has just asked, which I have to say is something that I do actually believe, and it'd be interesting to hear your point, is that are unpasteurized cheese more variable in quality and maybe texture as well? And when I mean variable, I'm not making necessarily a qualitative point. It could just be variable in the sense of more likely to get wider flavors.
That's a really, really interesting and good question. I would say not necessarily, but it requires a grip on the technical side of the make that not very many people have. And I think maybe a perfect illustration of that is the illustration actually of the Innis log, where when Joe and Amy, they had been making raw milk cheese for a long time, and it was quite variable from batch to batch. Some had more mold on them, some had less, some were much better than others. And then Amy showed up and decided that they were going to take it to the next level and use a whey starter. And I think all of us really braced ourselves to think, here we go. This is going to go from variable to extremely variable. And, we think it's the right thing to do. So let's go for it. But, hold on to your hats. And actually, the cheese got much, much less variable at that point. That the whey starters were really active. They were really raring to go. And, this is a cheese made from about the 100th generation of a whey starter. And along the way, it's been incredibly, different batches will have slightly different flavors. But I would say in the great scheme of cheeses, raw milk or pasteurized, it's a very, very consistent one. And I would attribute that all to the artfulness of Joe and Amy and their understanding of how to make cheese.
And talking of Amy, I understand that she's pregnant right now.
Yes, expecting the second.
I think we can hear Sasha in the background. Is that right?
I'm sorry about that. He wants to participate.
Well, that's absolutely fine. Well, on that note, thank you very much. It's been amazing to talk to you. I find raw milk, it's controversy, it's excitement, it's variable, you have to pay attention. Not everybody wants it. Some people think it's the complete ends of the earth. So I think it'll go on being a challenge and a love for many years yet.
I hope so.
Cool. Well, I'm going to say so. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're going to let you go with the magic thing of saying next week we have Irish cheeses. Washed rind, we're tasting Meline, Duras and Gabine. Considering last week I thought we were doing Druv, I have checked now. We are definitely doing Druv the week after. So that's matching brandy. Have you got any top tips on matching brandy? There you go, Bronwen.
It's the real flamethrower of the alcohol world. I would say, go big.
That's fortunately Druv and I are quite capable of that. So on behalf of me, thank you very much, Bronwen. Say goodbye.
Bye.
There's my button there. And on behalf of me, thank you very much. Thank you to the Academy of Cheese. If you want to know more about cheese, if you want to know more from me, my next webinar course begins next Tuesday the 9th. It's 3 Wednesdays, 2 hours of sessions in a row. I need a couple more bookings, so maybe you can be an Academy of Cheese on your way to Master Cheese. Apart from that, we've got lots of e-learning in the Academy of Cheese as well, so you can do it at your own pace, in your own time, and hopefully sometime in the next couple of months, we'll be bringing you bums on seats courses with our excellent training partners all around the UK and abroad, including Portugal. Hello, Portugal, where you can now learn about cheese from some of the best cheese knowledge brains in the world. So lots of love from me. See you next week for the Irish. It's going to be fantastic. That was Tuesday night is cheese night. Where's my button? There we go.